Good afternoon. We're now going to start our second session discussing the pre-tribunal reports from the state of Ohio and the report that we submitted in December of last year. For this afternoon's agenda, I have to submit for the record before the tribunal in this matter 3 different witness statements that I recorded slightly after the statements were made in the tribunal. They are 3 fairly different in subject matter approaches, so we can cover as much as possible of the problems we're encountering here in Ohio. The first video, each of them will be slightly less than 15 minutes long, will be from a young woman named Annie Burke. Annie lives beside a 30-year-old injection well in Athens County that has a horrible record of non-compliance going back decades, and yet it somehow still finds itself operating in our modern age, taking out-of-state fracking waste into Annie's community. Second will be from a professor in geology, Beiersdorfer. He's from the Youngstown State University. Ray's introduction came to him quickly one morning in the midst of an earthquake caused by an injection well close to his home. As a professor in geology, he began to study the problem of earthquakes and fracking in Ohio. He has a lot to say about what he's uncovered. The third statement will be from a woman whose name is Theresa Mills. Theresa's in Columbus, and she works in the grassroots organization in Ohio called the Buckeye Environmental Network. Serves to work with local groups, and she's worked with local groups all over the state on Ohio, particularly in getting them information about fracking in their communities. She knows a lot about the public participation problems we've had. So without any more further ado, I'm going to put up the statement of Annie Burke.
Good morning. I'm here today with Annie Burke, who's going to give some testimony about what her life's been in the state of Ohio in dealing with the problems of fracking. And can we start off, could you please give us your full name?
My name is Annie Burke.
And where do you live, Annie?
I live in Hockingport, Ohio. It's in Athens County, Ohio, which is where I've grown up as well as my parents. And it's only less than 3 miles from a very close injection well site.
And what do you do for a living, Annie? What's your profession?
I'm a registered nurse.
Going back to the People's Tribunal that we had here in Ohio, you spoke at some length about the Ginsburg injection well. Can you describe this well for us and give its history?
Yes, I actually had not realized that this well existed in our area until I joined Torch Can Do and was talking with other members. And when I first saw it, I was just appalled at what I was seeing. It's just this big open pit that looks disgusting and smells disgusting. I just can't believe that that's considered a protected area that's supposed to contain toxins from our environment. And this well is here in Athens County in Alexander Township. It's, like I said, it's open to any kind of animals. There is a fence around it, but it does not look that secure. I feel like animals could fall into it or come drink out of it. I don't understand how it's not putting toxins into the air. It's really old. It's a converted well, and I believe it to be, we have seen from the public records that it's been in violation many times of the few standards that govern these types of wells in Ohio.
What do you mean by it's a converted well?
It's an old oil and gas well that they now use to store and inject fracking waste.
And does a converted well have to meet the same standards as a new well?
My understanding is that the old wells that they converted were kind of grandfathered in, so they don't exactly have the same standards. Which I find appalling because they still have the same potential for contamination. Just because it's an old site that somebody just allowed to be used doesn't mean that it couldn't also release things out into the air and the water.
You said that this waste pit is fully open. Is it exposed to the weather? Every time it rains, does it fill with water?
Yes, it would be exposed to rain, evaporation, wind, that kind of, all of that would affect it because it's open. And it's also very close to a road. It is out in the country, driveways, but there are a lot of people that live nearby. There's a sheep farm down the road. Passerbys, people visiting it to see what it is, have experienced burning sensation in their eyes, nausea, being able to smell this foul smell. It's definitely a problem in that area.
You mentioned this well has a history of violations.
Yes, like I said, it's been operating for over 30 years, and many residents of Athens County have reported concerns about their drinking water supplies, the air that they're breathing. And there are reports that a person can access on the Ohio Department of Natural Resources website. You know, I'm a registered nurse, and I am used to reading lab reports and determining if they look like they're acceptable for the patient, you know, that kind of thing. And I find these reports and a lot of the tests that are done to be very hard to decipher, kind of intimidating. So I'm kind of off the question a little bit, but I also think that's a problem that they say, well, everything's publicly accessible, but one, you have to have a special computer program that is not inexpensive. You have to be able to figure out how to access this, which is not easy. I had to take a day of training to figure it out. And you actually have to have this right program that's expensive. In addition to the fact that residents of Athens County, many of them do not have a computer or access to the internet. So I feel that that is a problem because that's how they're getting by with things in an area that's considered more disadvantaged in a socioeconomic standpoint. So anyway, we have looked at some of the reports and have seen them mentioning violation, and there is one rule that if a well is inoperable for a certain length of time, then it should be entirely closed and plugged and just no longer accessible for use, which we had tried to get that to occur because this well was inoperable for many months. They're continuously reporting and it could not be used because of a faulty pump. So we wrote senators, we did protests, we sent letters, and they just put a new pump in, which it should have already been closed, so that shouldn't have happened. So they used a Band-Aid solution to fix a bigger problem and tried to work around a technicality. Like I said, these reports are very upsetting that when you do read them. Here's one. In 2016, when the well was listed as non-operational and had a faulty pump, suddenly 60 barrels of waste were added to the volume tables, which was not consistent with what should have been occurring since it wasn't being used. It doesn't seem to correspond with the rainfall during that time. There's really no explanation to it. And then according to the Athens Messenger newspaper, the ODNR spokesperson stated that 60 barrels of waste were ejected prior to the pump malfunction. We could not find the record of this. In my mind, this is one of two things. Either there's lying and using it, or somebody made a mistake and because they were showing lack of attention to detail and their reporting. Either of these frightens me. I don't want them supposedly safeguarding me, but then lying about what's actually occurring at these sites. Nor do I want people monitoring sites that can't pay attention to dates and numbers and keep track of what's going on. I don't trust any of that if they can't explain to me what's happened and why did that increased volume occur. The ODNR says that they're here to protect us and the environment and the community, but I don't see how that's occurring, especially at that site.
When you mentioned their long period of malfunction, I think you referenced the rule of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources that if a well's not functioning for 60 days, they're required to shut it down, and not only shut it down, but also actually plug the well so it can't be used again. Was it non-operable for more than 60 days?
Yes, I believe it was since about October of 2015, and they put the new pump in last fall, so that's over a year. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if they're actually really using it even now, but they technically could if there's a new pump.
I think you are also concerned from your testimony before the Ohio Tribunal about there being leaks at the site and the potential for contamination.
Yes, but the whole point of these wells is to contain this fluid and hopefully protect us. And there was an inspection report that we found on November 19th of 2015, and it stated that the 5-foot dumpster located next to the entrance to the unloading pad had large holes in the bottom. And this is the dumpster that's used to dispose of brine filters, which contains a lot of the contaminant. The report itself stated that that area behind the dumpster is contaminated. The contaminated soil must be removed and taken to an EPA landfill. We looked at all of the reports for the next several months, and there would be a time when the inspector would say, still hasn't been, everything's still in place, nothing's been removed, and a couple times I didn't even mention it. So it went several months before there was any cleanup. And then when it was finally noted that obviously a cleanup had occurred, the inspector could not get an answer about which USA EPA approved landfill it had been taken to. So we don't know for sure where it went, if it went to an appropriate place. Obviously, the stuff that was there had contaminated the soil for quite some time, so all of that area would be contaminated. And they did do stuff with the soil around it, but it was so much later, who knows what the rain and the runoff, where any contaminants would have gone to the air and through the ground during these months of nobody being held accountable for the little role that we do have.
Now, you said that you were able to access ODNR records. Was there any record governing this supposed cleanup or what they had done?
All I ever saw was the inspector stating that he could see that something had been done, the dumpster had been removed. Looked like the soil was fresh soil, but as I said, it was several months after the first time, which I think that's like locking the barn door after the cow gets out.
And there were no details ever presented to DNR about the nature of the cleanup. Annie, you talked about this dumpster holding brine filters. What's a brine filter, and should we be concerned about brine filters?
Well, just like any kind of filter, it's very important to the mechanisms. And if you just think about how your vacuum, the filters catches objects and particles and stuff as it goes through, that's what a brine filter would do. And we believe that the fluid in these injection wells is hazardous, contains contaminants. There would be contaminants trapped in the filter.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you talk about contaminants, is there any particular contaminant that worries you?
I'm very concerned about several different ones. There have been articles saying that there are different contaminants found in fracking waste that would be endocrine disruptors, which would cause the cancers and birth defects. It's also possibly very radioactive, which we know is a problem. I believe these brine filters are radioactive, and then we're just allowing them to just lay out sometimes, in a broken dumpster with holes in the bottom of it. And people around the area aren't being told that, so anybody walking by, taking a Sunday walk, is being exposed to this radiation. I really think that's another big injustice that's being perpetrated on my county. There's all these rules protecting these companies that they can protect their copyright fluid solution or whatever, but we're the ones that have to live it. We're the ones that are breathing the air. We're the ones drinking the water. We're the ones who have seen our family members die of cancers from other contaminants, and now we're just holding our breath for them to start saying that's what's causing the next wave, because we're out there being exposed. These companies are being protected, but we are not. We aren't even allowed to know for sure what's in things. We find things out. There are ways that we find out a little bit, and there have been studies of certain things that people can get a hold of, but there's all this hush-hush protect these companies. They don't need to be protected. My family needs to be protected.
With the brine filters and the concern for radiation, did the ODNR records show any testing that was done for radioactive contamination?
No, not that I'm aware of, no. Which I feel is pretty standard. I don't know of them doing those types of testing.
What about the overall monitoring of the site? Is there any monitoring for water pollution or for air pollution?
Well, interestingly, They were originally, when this was turned into a well for fracking waste, it was discussed in part of the permit was that they would put in a freshwater monitoring well so there could be testing and comparisons made about contamination. There is no well like this at that site, and there's never going to be one because that's an extra expense. And they haven't had it all this time. Why would they do it now? No one's making them do it. And it just feels like another example of how our government, our ODNR, is not protecting us. They're not taking the effort to make sure that there are safeguards in place. I don't want these wells here, but right now we have them, and so it angers and saddens me that even though we have a few rules and a few things we could do to try to help mitigate the problem, those aren't even happening. It makes me feel like my community isn't that important in the eyes of the ones who are making these decisions.
So the permit requires a groundwater monitoring well that's not present. The facility was allowed to operate long after it was required to be plugged. It had a requirement that there be a cleanup, but the cleanup was never documented in any way. That must give you, again, a lot of concern about where the loyalties of the Department of Natural Resources are. Did you try to speak to them about these problems, and what type of response did you get?
No response. Yes, I actually was very active because I really thought that with the pump not being operable, we could get this well, at least this well shut down and closed off and maybe at least help in one area. We sent new letters to the editor of newspapers, we wrote our senators, we contacted the ODNR. We did all of this, and the only thing that happened was that this pump showed up, which we weren't notified of. I've called my political representatives myself and left my phone number and email, and I've never heard anything back.
Well, Annie, thanks for your testimony today. Is there anything else you'd like the world to know about the situation here in your...
So that's the end of the first video. Now we're going to do the video of Dr. Beiersdorfer, who is an expert geologist. And Dr. Beiersdorfer's video is going to start off, the audio might be a little soft, but it'll, I think, soon pick up for you.
My name's Dr. Ray Beiersdorfer.
And what city do you live in, Doctor?
I live in Youngstown, Ohio.
What are your professional credentials?
I have 3 degrees in geology, a bachelor's degree, a master's, and a PhD in geology. And for the past, this is my 25th year, I've been a faculty member at Youngstown State University, where my current rank is a distinguished professor of geology.
How did you first get involved with fracking in Ohio, Professor?
I became aware of it due to it happening in other places. I worked in the oil and gas industry between my master's and PhD, so I knew about fracking back in the 80s, which was quite different from what's been happening now. My real awareness stemmed from the injection well that started earthquakes in 2011. In fact, that would have been 7 years ago on St. Patrick's Day, March 17th of 2011. I was sitting at home at my computer, and I felt an earthquake. And in fact, there were 2 that morning. And then I became aware that they were related with the injection well, which was taking the fracking waste. And so that's how I became aware.
Well, how has the overall level of earthquake activity changed in Ohio since fracking and injection wells began to operate?
Yeah, from about Revolutionary War time until, say, 2011, 2010, there had been about 120 earthquakes in Ohio. Most of them were out in western Ohio near Anna. There was some up near the Great Lakes in sort of Cleveland area. Some of those were due to human activity from a Class 1 injection well, and then sporadic earthquakes along the Ohio River. But again, about 120. We now have, I would estimate, counting the small ones, close to 2,000 earthquakes in this 8-year period, mostly focused in eastern Ohio in counties like where I live, Mahoney County, Trumbull County, where we're now, that had never had a historical record of earthquake, now have had hundreds of earthquakes.
Doctor, you testified at some length during the Citizens Tribunal about the North Star 1 injection well in Mahoning County. What occurred there that concerns you?
Well, they drilled that well in 2010, and I actually first became aware of it, but in actually the summer of 2010 when they were drilling it, because they hit a gas pocket, and I woke up in the middle of the night gasping for air. There had been a small blowout, and people were not aware of this. The police were driving around thinking there was a gas leak, knocking on people's doors. It turned out it was that well. They started injecting that December, and small earthquakes started that January. Again, it wasn't until March that we felt it. We then continued to have sporadic large earthquakes. In fact, we had 8.5 months of noticeable earthquakes that were felt and that were recorded. And what woke me up was that the ODNR, or Ohio Department of Natural Resources, was at that point was denying any connection between these earthquakes in close proximity to this well and the well. And my 80-year-old neighbor saw the connection. My freshman student saw the connection. Yet our state regulators were denying that there was any connection. They continued. There was an earthquake on December 24th, Christmas Eve. Fortunately, the Columbia University, which at ODNR's request had put up 4 portable seismometers, they were able to figure out exactly where the focus or hypocenter was, close proximity to the bottom of the well. They shut the well down on December 30th, and the next day, New Year's Eve, at around 3:30 in the afternoon, there was a magnitude 4.0, which caused localized damage. After that, the earthquakes continued, and there at least 566 earthquakes from that well. That well should have been shut down within 60 days after they shut it down back in 2012. Here we are in 2018, 6 years after, and they still haven't plugged that well down.
So what did ODNR do, the state regulator, about these earthquakes, and has what they've done been in any way effective?
Well, they've gotten worse. We've continued to have earthquakes. So that was 2011, during that year. In 2014, we had 2 issues. We had a fracking well in Poland, Ohio, southeast of Youngstown, that started to have earthquakes. They had 77 earthquakes on a fault that was 3 football fields in length, 300 meters in length, which ODNR then called a microfault. A microfault means something you need a microscope to see. Yet this thing was 300 meters in length, 77 earthquakes. And they admitted that it was due to fracking, and that wound up getting a lot of international and national attention because supposedly this was the first place in the United States where fracking had caused the earthquakes. Turned out that wasn't true. It turned out in the prior year, in 2013, October of 2013, there had been over 400 earthquakes in Harrison County in southern Ohio due to fracking. ODNR kept that secret. None of them were big enough to get on the regional U.S. Geological Survey network and let the world know about them. But the paper that finally was published and came out said that ODNR had deployed their portable seismometers to the site, meaning they knew about it, yet they kept it secret. They didn't put it on their website. Their rules, if it's a felt earthquake or it's a magnitude 2 or larger, it should go on their website for recent events. They kept it off their website. Eventually, they did put it on after the publication had come out, and I nagged them via email, why isn't this on? Why isn't this on? Also, after the Poland earthquakes, they had announced that any new fracking permits within 3 miles of a known fault were going to have special permit regulations and requirements. I've gone subsequently and found wells that were permitted within a mile of a known fault, and they had no special permit restrictions on them. I actually got from the head of oil and gas at ODNR, Rick Simmers, in writing that they were not even following their own rules. That has continued. There's now at least a half a dozen fracking sites down in southern Ohio, in Harrison County, that have caused earthquakes. I doubt very much, I haven't yet gone and checked, but I doubt very much if they even have any of these special permit conditions. We also, here in Trumbull County in 2014, we had a well that they drilled 2.9 miles from a high-risk dam on the reservoir for the drinking water supply for up to, I think, 400,000 people, including my own water supply. They put that in. They drilled 2 wells. They had started having earthquakes there. Again, ODNR kept them secret until one was large enough to get on onto the sort of the regional network and let the world know about it. And that one wound up causing 108 earthquakes on 2 different faults. And I just recently, a pre-publication came out this very week about earthquakes due to injection wells, an injection well in Washington County in southeastern near Marietta that has caused over 300, I think about 318 earthquakes in a complicated series of several faults. So things have not gotten better. Just the more that we're finding out about it, we're realizing how bad it actually is.
Has the Department of Natural Resources ever prepared a study or given any comprehensive report to the people of the state about this problem?
They, after the Youngstown earthquake, so that was the first, their papers, and let me back that up. The Ashtabula Class 1 injection well, there were some publications, not by the state to my knowledge, but by scientists from the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory. So there were some publications about that injection well. After the Youngstown, they prepared a rather lengthy preliminary report. They never did a final report. Then the ones that next were public, after the Poland earthquakes, all they did was a press release. I contacted them and said, after Youngstown, you did a report. Is there going to be a report? They said no. There was just a press release. I had to do a public records request to get more further information about that because they were not going to be forthcoming. Last year, there was just a notice that a well had been shut down because of seismic activity. Nothing other than a statement. I contacted ODNR and asked, I want the well number, the API number for the well. They wouldn't even give me that. So it's gotten worse, from a preliminary report to a press release, and now just a statement, and they won't even tell you which well it is. I suspect they didn't tell me which well it was because I was going to go back and look at the permit conditions and see that, again, they were violating their own rules from April of 2014. The preliminary report that you mentioned, can I go online today and look at that data and try to find out at least what the state has tried to put together about it? It was available online. I haven't checked recently, and so I think I checked last summer, and it still was available, but I haven't checked if it's available on. I would imagine it is, unless they've scrubbed it from their website.
Well, could you please sum up for me, Professor, your opinion on what the Department of Natural Resources record has been on fracking regulation?
I think it's been very poor, particularly with these induced earthquakes. They are not doing their due diligence. They are not going ahead and requiring the operators to prove that there's no faults. We now know that there is a series of faults deep in the basement, in the geologic basement, 9,000 feet below the surface. They are not requiring, they're allowing the companies to just go right ahead and monitor things. I believe in the precautionary principle, especially after there is some evidence that this is happening, yet they are not doing that, and I feel that they have really dropped the ball in terms of protecting public health and safety.
With all this history of earthquakes in northeast Ohio with injection wells, and I guess other parts of the state with production wells, is DNR still authorizing injection wells in these areas of known activity, known earthquakes?
Well, right here where we're sitting in Brookfield, Ohio, they've actually already permitted 2, and they have 3 more that the company has applied for. These poor citizens are going to get 5 injection wells. I've looked at what the proposed volumes for that and applied it to a formula from seismologists from the U.S. Geological Survey, where according to their work, there's a relationship between the amount of fluids you pump underground and the energy associated with those fluids. and then have, if there is an earthquake, again, it's a gamble. If there's a fault there, that energy is going to get released. And the calculations, based on the proposed injection volumes from here, they're going to have anywhere over a magnitude 5 earthquake if there's a fault and if it all gets released in one seismic event. They're basically doing some sort of perverse science experiment with the citizens of Brookfield, Ohio. So no, they are not doing their due diligence, and they are not protecting public health and safety. They had a public comments period. I provided them with that information. I have not heard anything back from them, and frankly, I don't expect to hear anything back from them.
That is the second statement from Dr. Beiersdorfer. Now I'd like to show you the third and last statement I have for you today from Theresa Mills about public participation in Ohio.
And who do you work for? Or how is it that you work with these communities?
Well, I have been an activist, an environmental activist for 30 years, so I have a lot of experience. I do represent 2 organizations. Statewide, I represent the Buckeye Environmental Network, and nationally, I work with the Center for Health, Environment, and Justice, which was started by Lois Gibbs from Love Canal fame.
You've said that you have a large concern about the environmental justice impacts of fracking in Ohio. What is environmental justice, and what are those impacts that concern you?
To me, environmental justice and human rights should go hand in hand. Environmental justice is the equal treatment of the population. No one population should be overburdened more than another population when it comes to environmental stresses. And there is no bigger stress in the state of Ohio right now than fracking to our local communities.
Well, what are those impacts that affect environmental justice from fracking?
Well, what I see, not only the health impacts and the psychological impacts that occur with fracking and injection wells, but there is a huge human rights violation in the state of Ohio that's being supported by the US EPA. And that is, there is a total lack of citizen participation in the permitting process, both with the production wells and the oil and gas wells. It is a human rights violation to not have a say in what goes on in your own community, what goes on right next door. An injection well or a production well can be 150 feet from a domicile, from someone's house. I know earlier people said 1,800 feet or 1,800 yards. They can be as close as 150 feet. When it comes to production wells, you will not know that there is a production well being proposed for your community unless you see, 1, the ravaging of the land, preparing for the well pad, or 2, all of a sudden a rig shows up in your skyline. Other than that, you have no indication that a production well is being proposed. You have no opportunity to comment on any permit, and that's for production wells. Injection wells, there is a phony 15-day comment period, a public notice which is very inadequate. They expect people to be able to read an application. It's not a permit, it's just the application, which is like 2 or 3 pages, and be able to make a technical comment on an application. I want to make a technical comment or permit, not an application, because by the time the permit is issued, there could be changes, but I never get to comment on the permit. All I get to comment on is the application. That is an injustice. That is a human rights violation.
You said that the 15-day comment period is ineffective. Why?
Typically, most citizens would not have the technical expertise to be able to technically comment on a permit. And even if they had the ability to hire a technical person, within 15 days, that's not going to happen. And the information in an application does not give the technical person the ability to comment. In the permit application, there's supposed to be an area of confinement. So there's supposed to be a confining zone.
That's a geologic term?
Yes, sorry. Yes, that's a geological term. But that's not stated in the permit application. But there is supposed to be a confining zone. Okay. So when I looked at the torch wells, the K&H wells, I noticed that there was no confinement zone listed. So I called and made an appointment with a geologist from Ohio University. And I actually had to do a PowerPoint of what I saw in order to be able to convey my concerns to the geologist. Because what I was seeing was there was no confinement zone, solid confinement zone. And she agreed with me that it was already a fractured confinement zone.
So you've got a complicated geologic situation.
Right.
And you've got 15 days to analyze
Right.
it and develop comments.
Absolutely. And as a citizen, not as a technical expert. Most people can't hire technical experts, and they don't realize, well, let me call the university to see if they've got someone that can at least look at this. You can't do that in 15 days.
And you only have the 15 days if you see the legal notice
Absolutely.
in the newspaper.
Absolutely. If you see the legal notice and you understand what that legal notice is saying, then that makes a difference.
Now, fracking in Ohio is mostly in the southeastern part of the state. That's
Right.
where the shale play is located geologically. I think it's also pretty well known that southeastern Ohio is also considered Appalachian.
Right.
And it's an area of significant economic disadvantage compared to much of the rest of the state. Does that factor into your concerns about environmental justice?
It does factor into my concerns a great deal. And one of the reasons is because it factors into my concerns, but nobody else's. I'm not talking about citizens, but I'm talking about governmental agencies that are supposed to be, especially federal government, that are supposed to be under, Clinton's executive order on environmental justice. All of these things should be taken into consideration. And the state of Ohio does not consider environmental injustice whatsoever.
Have you notified the US EPA and their Environmental Justice Office about your concerns about the disparate impacts on this area?
Yes, we did. We have notified US EPA several times. We've, gone to them, asking them to do several things, and they've just brushed us off. So we did take a step and sent a letter to the Office of Environmental Justice in Washington, D.C., a lengthy letter quoting the laws, quoting where Ohio Department of Natural Resources were in violation of federal laws. And to our great, great disappointment, the Office of Environmental Justice also blew us off. So that's one of the reasons we have tried every step that I can think of. I've tried all the tricks in my book. And I'm just to the point is, I don't know what to do anymore. So that was why we initiated the original Ohio tribunals, to give citizens a chance to have their say. We're not sure what's going to happen with that yet, but during the tribunal, citizens were crying, and I went out into the hallway and the one lady said, "You don't understand. This is the first time I feel that someone really cared and someone listened to me." That is shameful. That is absolutely shameful. We should not have to, spend our money to hold tribunals when it should be the obligation of the state of Ohio and the federal government to protect us. They should be protecting our right to participation, and they should be protecting our right to information, and we have none of that.
Is there any federal law that applies to the production wells that use fracking?
No. No, not that I can think of, because unlike injection wells, there is federal laws, but production wells, I think those are just regulated by the state. And, with the captured agency of the Ohio Department of Natural Resources, who are in bed with the petroleum industry, what do we expect? They're going to, they know what side what's the saying? They know what side their bread is buttered on. So
I know that saying.
Yeah, so they're not going to go against anything the oil and gas industry wants. And citizens are the ones to suffer.
You said that there's a federal oversight layer that at least addresses injection wells.
Right.
Now, I assume with all the explosion in fracking in the last few years that there's been a lot of activity and changes and improvements in that federal law. Would I be correct in thinking that?
You would totally be wrong on that. Ohio received primacy in 1983 to regulate injection wells. And that was under statute or code. It's not a code. It's 1425. Which was 30 years ago, and their rules or their laws had not changed in 30 years. Actually, it was just a guidance that was written. Those have not been updated in 30 years, even though the injection wells and the production waste has changed greatly. With the addition of chemicals, with the addition of the radioactive, isotopes in the waste, and the lack of just caring. Again, we wrote the letter under 1425, and here's what really bothered me. One of the things that bothered me about this is, if you look at the next state over, Pennsylvania is not, they did not file for primacy under, I can't remember the title or the code, but Ohio did. So Pennsylvania is regulated by both the federal EPA and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection. So it takes much longer. The requirements are much more strict and stringent than they are in Ohio. When you come to Ohio, it's like we might as well go to the corner of Broad and High where the State House is and just hand out permits willy-nilly, because that's what they're doing. But, so actually the federal EPA is encouraging, and there's a word I'm looking for, perpetuating?
Perpetuating, yes.
Perpetuating the environmental justice itself because of the difference in the regulations between Pennsylvania and Ohio. Pennsylvania has a handful or two handfuls of injection wells. And their statement always is, well, we'll just send the waste to Ohio. So the EPA, US EPA, is creating their own environmental justice issue by the way they have issued primacy.
So how many wells, injection wells, are there in Pennsylvania, and how many in Ohio?
Well, they've just issued a couple of more permits, so I think they may have 11.
11?
11.
And Ohio has?
And Ohio has 238 permits have been issued, but back in 2011, when we first were inundated with fracking, we had 144. So from 2011 to 2018, we went from 144 up to 238.
And the federal government designates counties as being Appalachian.
Right.
Of all those injection wells, do you know approximately what percentage of those are in the economically disadvantaged Appalachian counties?
Yes. And there's 32 Appalachian counties, and out of those 32, I think 23 have injection wells, but those 23 counties take in 3/4 of the injection waste.
Let me try to summarize this, Theresa.
Lots of work.
There's no federal law overseeing the fracking production wells.
No.
The federal law that pertains to injection wells dates back to the 1980s and hasn't been updated at all in Ohio since the advent of the fracking revolution.
Correct.
And the most economically disadvantaged, most politically disadvantaged portion of Ohio is getting over 3/4 of the fracking waste.
Right. Right.
And you think there's an environmental justice issue involved in those three facts?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And one thing is, in Athens, where we are right now in Athens County ranks #1 in the state for poverty, for being in poverty. So it's not the people, they're working poor. You know, it's, so when, like with production wells and injection wells, I see a lot of counties where some citizens will say, well, it's jobs, you know. And then we have industry that goes in and what I call buys out the local politicians by the promise of, well, we'll give you some money to update your fire department, or we'll give you money to build a building, or in Columbiana County, they bought them a truck, a police car, and a crime dog. So there's a lot of citizens, when they see that, they think, well, it's good for the community. Well, it's not good for the community. That's like dangling a radioactive carrot in front of a hungry rabbit and expect it not to eat that carrot. It's an injustice. These are human rights violations, and this needs to stop before there is so much disease and so many cancers that it will be too late.
Yes, that's the end of our 3 statements. And I think we have about 10 minutes left, maybe, to have questions. Francis, perhaps you'd like to ask your question again that you tried to ask earlier.
No, I was referring back to one of the statements that were made during the first presentation before the lunch break, related to the media's smear campaigns against environmental organizations and environmental NGOs. That is basically one of the first, let's say, signals of the worrying tendency that is actually repeating itself in any situation where there are there's strong resistance in the ground against large-scale infrastructure projects, especially in extractive industry. And I was wondering whether this is just something that is confined to media misrepresentation or slandering of environmental activists, or if this is also followed by some consistent behavior by police, for instance, in terms of intimidation or restricting the capacity of initiative or environmental groups. So is there any, let's say, signal that this kind of smear campaigns can actually lead to criminalization of environmental rights defenders and to some specific police control over territories and demonstrations, as the case was, for instance, in Standing Rock?
I think in the fracking situation, while there is intimidation by the state, and I think with the expressions of hostility that the regulators constantly give the citizens. They're definitely trying to push citizens away and get them not to care. There was only one incident where the police were involved that was similar to your concerns. And that was when the Department of Natural Resources had a public information meeting that they very tightly controlled. And I've heard from several people who were at that meeting, the police presence was extremely large. Especially for a small rural area, to have a lot of police is somewhat unique. But in addition to just police themselves, they had guard dogs. So here you come out to meet with your state officials, and you're met with guard dogs before you can ask your questions. That's as close as I've seen. Oftentimes with my clients, claims that, oh, hey, if you continue on to question our activity, if you hurt our profits, we'll bring a lawsuit against your clients for interference with our contract rights. And to which I say, fine, go ahead, because we'll countersue you for trying to intimidate us on our exercise of our free speech rights. And I have that conversation more often than I'd like to think of. There's never yet been a lawsuit filed because they realize that still free speech rights is farther than what any court wants to go to suppress. So up until the current administration in the White House, I was not really concerned about those matters, Francis. Mm-hmm. With this new administration that's gone so much further than any other one, the fact that the reach of that new president of ours seems to be heading throughout the entire Republican Party. Now we're entering another campaign season, and it seems like so many candidates are falling over themselves to swear their fealty to the new president, that we're on a path that may lead to the type of concerns that.
Thank you.
Yes, Gill Boehringer here. Actually, Francesco asked the question that I was going to ask, and I think it's important for us to state on the basis of research that I've done and others, that being a human rights activist or a supporter, a lawyer, is a very dangerous activity around the world. In the Philippines, for example, where I mainly do my research, environmental activists are being killed all of the time. It's one of the most dangerous countries in the world, but also lawyers and journalists and others who are trying to protect the public and the rights of nature. So I guess I'd have to say to you, Rick, it must be very frustrating for you to do the work that you're doing and receive the rubbish you get from the corporations and the government agencies. But at least you're not being disappeared or killed as of today. I wanted also to maybe follow up on what Louis was asking this morning, and that is, you've mentioned that in civil cases, it's very difficult for systemic reasons and other reasons. I was wondering if any criminal sanctions are available, and have they been brought against the corporations? I think I know the answer. As a result of their operations and or corruption, tax evasion, other things of that sort, which might be connected with their operations in fracking.
There was one example of a successful criminal prosecution, but it was brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the northern part of Ohio. This involved a company that was transporting fracking wastewater, and they were supposed to take it to treatment or disposal facilities. And neighbors of the truck garage where they would be stored began to notice that there were strange odors in that garage, and certainly began to grow concerned, and they noticed that the trucks were dumping fracking water into the local river. This is very close to Youngstown. And someone passed that word along to the ODNR, and ODNR actually sent investigators out there. Those investigators got information, sent it to the U.S. Attorney's Office, frankly, because I don't think that they trusted the state prosecutors in any type of a criminal case. But they caught them red-handed. They get a conviction and get an agreed-to sentence. But that was the only time, and it involved some pretty alarming circumstances.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we've had spills, kind of routine at some of these sites, but it's the industry itself, a legitimate part of the industry doing that. That's not where we're seeing enforcement.
Right.
We see explosions. That's where there's not enforcement. There were very unsafe conditions allowed at the time of the explosion.
Yeah. I wanted to follow that up, if I may. I noticed that in your report, you refer to the guiding principles on business and human rights. Many critics of the infamous, I would say, pillars: state protection, business respect for rights, and providing access to justice. Many critics of those so-called pillars believe that while they sound good, and who could deny that, nevertheless, they're really failing and almost inevitably likely to fail because of what has happened through the market, globalization, and in particular, the dominance of corporations over states and their agencies. Would you like to?
Sorry, that's my staff came in to.
It was black.
It's dinner time.
We're in trouble now, mate. Would you like to comment on the principles and what might be done to advance the establishment of norms and implementation?
Yeah, I agree with the reservations. I mean, the statements. Just one moment, please.
Must be a warning.
Yeah. The statements do make appropriate comments about the role of non-governmental actors, that corporations need to be brought into the system of accountability as well. Because in so many areas, the real force you're in opposition to is a corporate force and not a governmental force. Mm. That's certainly the case in Ohio. We often have in Ohio is government acts as a sponge, stands between the community and the corporate actor, so that they take the rage of the public, they take the worry, and the corporation stays high and dry. The problem here in the United States, and our discussion of legislative enactments we've had in Ohio, which have been essentially dictated by the oil and gas industry. Our legislature's been little more than a stenographer to write it down and pass it into law. When industry has that level of control over the governing process, I don't think saying nice words about corporations being responsible are going to get us very far. The United States of America has a huge problem now with campaign finance. It's something I've seen in the environmental movement for at least 25 years. Now with our Citizens United case, it lets corporate money go directly into the political system and to be untraceable. Now everybody, I think, sees what I've been able to see in the environmental movement, what the sale of our government is. It's more than the legislature, it's the courts too. I used to have a pretty good success rate in court, and I've seen it peter out over the years, and frankly, I don't think that petering out's due to my becoming a worse lawyer as I gain more experience. We can't talk about corporations playing nice when they are this much in control of this system this much control of the media and how it gets described to the public. We need more aggressive steps than that. That's my view, Gill.
I think many would agree with you.
Well, it's been a pleasure. You've shown a lot of patience to listen to the Ohio story. I appreciate that patience very much, and I wish you Godspeed. Enjoy your upcoming week, and I look to speaking to you close to the end of the process. And I wish you well. Thank you much, and